Hi, and welcome to the second ever teaser interviews with the Hemingway Review. I'm Suzanne del Gizzo. I'm the editor of the Hemingway Review, and today I am here with Juliet Conway, who has contributed a recent article to the spring 2021 issue. It's called, let me get the title exactly right, To Hell with Women Anyway, Flirtatiousness and Male Entitlement in Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises. And this is a particularly appropriate topic for Juliet. She is a recent Ph.D. graduate from the University of Edinburgh, and her dissertation is on flirtatiousness. And it's across American and British authors, or is it all American authors?
So all American authors from about 1868 to 1928.
Okay, well, great. Wonderful to have you, Juliet.
Okay. Thank you.
Great. So how did you find your way to Ernest Hemingway?
So I actually came to The Sun Also Rises through quite a circuitous route. So for my thesis, I was looking at Anita Lou's Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, which is not necessarily a kind of matching book. They're quite different in tone and style and everything. But I was really interested that when I read some criticism about Lou's novel and the heroine Lorelei Lee, someone had kind of classed her in that category of badly behaved woman, and Brett Ashley was one of the other characters that they suggested she kind of fell into this wide category with. So it was initially that kind of got me on to The Sun Also Rises, and reading through it, I immediately was kind of seeing all these connections between these quite different characters, but again in ways that their behaviors always framed in terms of male responses to it, in terms of how they both do kind of walk the line of transgressive femininity, albeit in quite different ways. So I think people are always surprised when I say that that's how I got onto it, but it's sometimes those kind of unexpected connections that lead you to your next thing.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. From a Hemingway scholar's perspective, it's a kind of delightful piece, right? Because first of all, you survey, as you know, one must, the existing criticism on Brett, that she is just, a bitch and, mean-spirited, evil woman. And you also survey the scholars who treat her a little bit more kindly, a little bit more compassionately. But in the end, you quote Linda Patterson Miller's observation that Brett is more often judged than understood. And her thing really seems to anchor, at least I thought it anchored your approach to Brett. So what you seem to be doing, to my mind, is that you're looking at Brett sort of on her own terms. What happens when we look at Brett that way?
I think she just becomes a completely different character, really. It's so interesting because so much of the criticism has been kind of looking from the male perspective of Brett. And even for me, coming to the novel the first time, because I'd kind of read about her as classed within these kind of like difficult women, I think it took a few reads for me to even kind of shift my perspective on Brett a little bit, because right from the start, you're kind of expecting to dislike her in a lot of ways. You're expecting, she's seemingly causing this chaos for men. And until you start to kind of interrogate that, it is very easy to kind of read her as almost that quite one-dimensional figure that just kind of causes harm for the sake of it. So I think that reading Brett on her own terms is taking a step away from kind of how other people, specifically men, react to her behavior, and actually start to look at why she behaves that way in the first place. And I think it's just common in how lots of heroines are read in fiction in general, that especially if it's kind of sexual bad behavior, people tend to kind of read the results of that and how other people respond to that, rather than kind of thinking about the factors that, like, why does Brett behave as she does in the first place if you take away all of those different competing perspectives on her?
Okay, yeah, that's great. And then also, what is the role of male entitlement there? How do the expectations of the men affect the way that we read Brett?
So I think a lot of the kind of assumptions that male characters make in the novel, and a lot of the disappointments they have, is because they've assumed that Brett should love them back and should commit just to them. It's not rational. Lots of the time it's the case that she's saying one thing and they're just taking something else from this, or she's told them something and they're continuing to follow her around, or continuing to pin their hopes on the future and then getting angry when that's not fulfilled. So I think that it's that sense of entitlement in terms of she's not really causing difficulty for them because she's lying to them. She's causing difficulty because they refuse to listen when she does say things, or when they see parts of her behavior, they assume that she'll act differently in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. So the other thing that I found really interesting about your piece was the focus on flirtation. And you pointed me to a book that I have to read now by Adam Phillips called On Flirtation. And now I know that your dissertation focuses on the topic as well. In the case of Brett, you focus both on the liberatory and the limiting aspects of flirtation. So can you tell us a little bit about the way flirtation factors into your work then?
Yeah, so flirtation for me is just an absolutely fascinating type of behavior, hence why I did a whole thesis on it. Because I think it just so kind of complicatedly toes that line between good and bad behavior. So it's kind of sexually transgressive, but not quite. So women, especially in this kind of period of literature, they evade kind of being traditionally bad women, but they're not quite good women either. And in terms of the kind of freedoms that it offers, the idea of kind of suggesting possible futures which may or may not be realized, everything kind of exists in these threshold spaces. And I think that's so fascinating in terms of both what that means for women in terms of power dynamics, but also how they're then judged by other people. So I think flirtatious characters tend to be judged particularly harshly because they're kind of chaotic. They're not just clearly bad, so they can be kind of easily written off and categorized. Those kind of in-between moments, I think, is what kind of drew me to flirting as a behavior in the first place. And Adam Phillips's book in particular, he talks a lot about that idea of flirting as a potentially dangerous behavior because it kind of subverts stability. And I think that's exactly what Brett is doing in terms of being able to have some power over the men in the story, but she's also not completely free from men in general. She still has to kind of get this power through this traditionally female means. And I think that's kind of what makes her an interesting kind of threshold character herself.
So we were talking a little bit before we started recording about your dissertation. So I know you also tackle Edith Wharton, and you didn't say which Edith Wharton. Which Edith Wharton is it?
This is the House of Mirth.
Okay, so good. So House of Mirth and also Daisy Miller as part of your dissertation. And women pay a high price for flirtation in those books. Do you see any movement in the character of Brett, being written in the 1920s, 1926? Does she pay as high a price that, of course, the other two characters, Lily Bart and Daisy Miller, wind up dead?
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting question, and one that I was kind of trying to trace through my thesis a bit, because it's at what point flirtatious heroines stop dying, basically, is the really good question, slightly morbid question. Mm-hmm. And I think it just is this idea that there is still payment. It might look different, but it doesn't fundamentally change the fact that women are never able to kind of leave their novels as unresolved flirts. They're either killed off or something happens to kind of put them back into a more stable category to some extent. And I think the idea of the kind of judgment lingers on past when you would think it would. Brett obviously looks superficially a lot freer than characters like Daisy Miller, and she can behave much more outrageously flirtatiously than Daisy and not get such immediate repercussions. But there definitely is still this kind of shadow of judgment in the background. And as Jake says about women never being free from paying, I think that is very much true for Brett, just as it was for Daisy or Lily or any of those earlier heroines as well.
Good, great, thank you. And so if we do you think about Brett as a Hemingway hero then? And if you do, what does that do to her? And if you don't, why don't you?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I think kind of yes and no, in that she definitely has those kind of characteristics. She's a very powerful character. She's also someone that's learned how to kind of live with her troubles to some extent, those kind of markers of heroism. But then on the other hand, she is still very much kind of caught in a paradigm which places women in particular situations. She's kind of free and chooses how to act to a certain extent, but yet she always kind of has to move from man to man to man. It's that kind of nuance of she might have that autonomy and that power to choose to be with a certain man or not, but she never seems to be able to just be without one altogether.
Okay, fair enough. Unlike Jake, who has to be without her ultimately. So maybe the test of the Hemingway hero is, can you be alone? So finally, I guess, just because we're Hemingway scholars who pay attention to this channel, this interview, do you have any other opinions about other female characters in Hemingway's work on this question of flirtatiousness?
Well, interestingly, even within Sun Also Rises, I'm kind of fascinated by the character of Frances, because again, she's a character that has a hugely bad reputation, especially in criticism. Sometimes you can just get opinions that, again, it's that thing that when you're kind of going into it and you're like, oh yeah, she is a difficult character, she's annoying, she's like self-obsessed, she's manipulative. But then so are so many other characters in the novel. And again, I think it is a specifically like how we read female characters that she's kind of written off like that. And actually, I think she provides kind of an interesting counterpoint to Brett in terms of how the men in the novel would want women to behave. Because on one hand, they are very unhappy with the fact that Brett fails to commit to one man, whereas Frances does want to, and that also is not acceptable. She's a pest. She should go away. She's lost her youth. She's lost her beauty. And either way, it's kind of like women are a bit damned if they do, damned if they don't sort of thing. So I think she's another character that I'd be quite interested to take a deeper look at, because similar to Brett, I think superficially she's kind of often framed as this primarily negative character without much thought about kind of what her side of that story might be.
It's so interesting to me. And you mentioned Georgette in your piece. And of course, everybody's a lot more comfortable with Georgette because the terms of the exchange are so much clearer. So I suppose you're learning a great deal about female sexual expression through your study of the time period.
Yes, absolutely.
Great. Well, thank you. I'm so grateful that you accepted this invitation to take a risk on only our second ever episode. But we were working on the issue, and I work with an editorial intern who, she's about 21 or 22 years old, and she just said, "This is just such a cool article. I am so excited about it." And I said, "That's it. We are going to invite Juliet to do this." So thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.